I'm Adrian Haverstadt, Director of Criminal Justice here at Berkeley College. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The Justice Center at Dr. Halvey. In this particular playlist, which I've titled Foundational Principles of a Republic, we will be exploring various aspects pertaining to the Republic form of government. In addition, we'll be examining the systems of government or governance that was set up by King David in the Old Testament. And throughout this study, we'll be drawing down conclusions on how King David's rule of governance informs the United States constitutional republic approach, as well as the structure we use in our U.S. criminal justice system today. So a logical place to begin is to ask a question: why look at King David? What's significant about him and the government structure that he put in place? Well, in the Holy Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a book called 2 Samuel. And in chapter 8, verse 15, we're told that David reigned over all of Israel and administered justice and equality to all of his people. He reigned over all of Israel and administered justice and equality to all of his people. Justice and equality, the two primary outcomes we look for when we're measuring the effectiveness of legal systems and forms of governance today. The Bible has chosen to showcase the governance of King David as being one of equality and fairness for all. That's worthy of us noting, is it not? So in this first session, the aim is to identify the structure of King David's governing system and to note how it's really significant, but also very similar to what we have here in the United States of America. The Bible clearly states in 2 Samuel that David sought justice and equality through the legal system or the governance system that he put in place. So what do we know about David's system of governance? First of all, we know that he set up his seat of government in the center of the country, in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in the center of the country where most of God's people, the Israelites, lived. It was significant that he chose to place it in the center because up until this time, the north and the south of God's people were warring with one another. They were still in tribes, so to speak, and they were conflicted between one another. So David, in his keen insight, wanted to communicate that he was governing for all the people by choosing the location he did for placing his seat of government. He didn't want one region to feel favored over another. Perhaps that's why the seat of government for us here in the United States of America was set up as a standalone district, not identified with any state in particular, because it's for all the people. When it comes to governing and communicating equality and fairness for all, location is important. We've got to be with people. If we say we value them, then we've got to be with them. And David's approach communicated that. Second, we know that David appointed judges that were representative of people groups and geographic locations throughout the land. They were to settle disputes and ensure that justice would be served. These judges appointed by David were expected to uphold the law with impartiality and without favoritism, treating both the powerful and the weak equally. Third, we know that David's legal system had checks and balances. There was a legislative branch that was the Torah, the law which God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, the Torah. The Torah served as the primary constitution for God's people at that time, and in many respects, it still does to this day. In King David's system of governance, the Torah was the constitution for the nation. There was also a judicial branch in David's system of governance. The judicial branch was made up of prophets, people appointed by God. It was made up of judges, people who were appointed by the king David himself. Each were given the responsibility of interpreting the legislation or the Torah and to hand down rulings or to pass sentences accordingly. Finally, in David's form of government, there was an executive branch as well, and that was David himself, the king. His role as executive officer depended upon the popular support of the people and the good graces extended to him by the prophets and the judges. So you see something very similar in terms of how David set up his form of government. An executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch, each coinciding with one another, because that is the foundation of a healthy republic, a healthy form of government. King David's legal system or form of governance was based on impartiality, meaning that there was no one above the law. Even the king himself had to obey the law, God's law, what is commonly referred to as higher law. You know, this reality is clearly demonstrated in 2 Samuel chapter 11. In this particular passage of sacred literature, King David committed adultery with a lady by the name of Bathsheba, which then led to an unwanted pregnancy, which then led to a foiled attempt to cover up the pregnancy. And finally, that act of adultery ended up in the murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. Are you familiar with that story? David sees Bathsheba and calls her into his quarters and takes her sexually. She gets pregnant. David, in an attempt to cover up that pregnancy, invites Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, back in from the front lines to be with his wife, hoping that he will come back, sleep with his wife, and everybody will think that the baby is Uriah's, and David will be hailed as a great person who helped facilitate this new baby by bringing Uriah back to be with his wife. And everything is good and life goes on happily ever after. But in the story, Uriah came back, but he camped out at the door of David's castle, his palace. He didn't want to be laying around with his wife, enjoying freedom, when his brothers that he was sworn to be with in battle were still out fighting the fight. And so that time that Uriah spent back in Jerusalem, he did not spend it with his wife. So there was a foiled attempt to cover up this sin. And so what did David do? He arranged to have Uriah put in a position where his life would be taken in battle. So that's the story. And in this particular case, the executive branch committed several crimes, sin, if you will, against the Constitution of that day, the Torah. The judicial branch, represented by the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 12, interpreted the actions in light of the Torah and noted that the executive branch had done wrong and issued a sentence. And that sentence was that the child would die based upon what God said, and that David's kingdom would eventually be divided. So we see the branches that are set up functioning. And there is no respecter of persons. The king or executive branch is responsible to the Constitution, to the judicial branch, and everything is playing out as it should. And the key to this story, I think, is that the executive branch, King David, did not deny or challenge the authority of the judicial branch. He valued the republic to the place where he admitted his wrong, his guilt, and was willing to accept the punishment. In fact, if you look at this text in the Bible, this story, this account in the Bible, you'll see where David says, I deserve to die because of my sin. because I offended the Torah, so to speak. He accepted that responsibility. That shows great respect for the system of a republic that he set up to govern the people with fairness and equality. You know, what David did is perhaps the first time it ever occurred in ancient history. You know, history records several instances when kings and pharaohs, monarchs and dictators went on murderous rampages when accused of wrongdoing, rather than submitting to the authority of the Constitution or the legislation of their times. When called on the carpet, rather than taking responsibility, they tried to silence the naysayers. The precedent of no one being above the law, God's law, higher law, is the foundation of a republic form of government. King David's legal system was just and equitable to all and should be the standard for governance today, regardless of the time or the place in history. In a constitutional form of governance, one eye of the justice system must remain closed to race, class, gender, and other means of which people are marginalized today, while the other eye of justice must remain wide open and fixed on the higher law of God when it comes to defining values and setting ethics and passing legislation and determining how a civil society treats one another, and the focus of our leadership and influence and resources globally. King David got it right, and so did the founders and the framers of our constitutional republic here in the United States of America. My fellow Americans, this is our watch. Let's be sure to follow in lockstep by adhering to these foundational principles and emulating the service and the sacrifice and the leadership made by those who have gone before. God bless the United States of America.